Good afternoon. My name is Sargon de Jesus, and I am a contractor with the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Water. My role is to serve as a moderator and timekeeper for today's meeting. I want to thank you for dedicating your time and your expressed interest in today's webinar on the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act. The purpose of today's webinar is to enhance public awareness about the newly passed Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, also known as VIDA, and provide opportunity for engagement. During the webinar, the EPA and the U.S. Coast Guard will provide a general overview of VIDA, discuss interim and future discharge requirements, describe future state and public engagement opportunities, and answer select clarifying questions raised by the audience via the questions box feature. In a moment, I will turn the webinar over to the EPA's Office of Water and the U.S. Coast Guard to provide opening and welcoming remarks. Before I do that, I want to give a few housekeeping notes for everyone on the session. For technical issues with the webinar, please use the questions box located in the GoToWebinar interface. And this is typically located on the right-hand side of your screen. If it has been collapsed, you can click the orange arrow to expand the interface and access the questions box again. If you find that you have connectivity issues during the session, either with visual or audio lag, consider switching to a call-in number instead of using your computer speakers. The call-in information is located in the audio pane of that same GoToWebinar interface. Aside from the speakers, however, all microphones and phone lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar. We will hold two brief question and answer periods during today's webinar. The first question and answer period will be approximately halfway through the presentation, and the second question and answer period will follow the presentation. All questions will be received in writing via that GoToWebinar questions box. You can type in your questions directly through that window at any time. Please keep in mind that we may not be able to answer every question due to time constraints. With that, I will now turn the meeting over to Mr. Lee Forsgren, the Deputy Assistant Administrator of the EPA Office of Water.
Thank you very much. I wanted to welcome everyone to the webinar today. And thank you for joining the EPA and the Coast Guard to learn more about the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, commonly known as VIDA. That was one of the major concessions we made to the Coast Guard early in this discussion. Today's webinar is the first in a series of public engagements that we in the Coast Guard will be undertaking under this act as we develop our regulations to implement the act. I will start by saying we've had an incredibly productive working relationship with the Coast Guard. We are developing our regulations in tandem and with very close relationship, because we both realize we are under tight timelines and have the only way that those timelines could possibly be met would be to be working closely together, so there would be no surprises as we go through the process. This is the first of two webinars that will be held, and then we're going to have a live in-person discussion on the 29th and 30th of May at the United States Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, New York. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Captain Brady from the Coast Guard. I'll start by saying, we have a great working relationship when EPA is willing to give the Coast Guard the last word on the discussion, but I'll turn it all over to Captain Brady at this point.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Forsgren. I'm Captain Brady, the Chief of the Office of Operating Environmental Standards for the Coast Guard. And on behalf of the Coast Guard and Admiral Netto, the Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy, we'd like to thank you for the opportunity to provide some public comments and outreach and answer some of the burning questions out there. Everyone should know that the Coast Guard's been working very closely with the EPA since the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act was passed, and we've been making every effort to comply with the specified timelines and regulatory process requirements. VIDA represents a significant rulemaking for the Coast Guard, and we're utilizing all of our resources to meet all those obligations. We continually strive to implement practical, effective, and attainable compliance solutions in a very transparent process. And so we look forward to working with all the interested stakeholders. And again, would like to thank the EPA for this opportunity today. Thanks.
Thank you, Captain Brady. I will now turn it over to Mr. Jack Falk from the EPA and Mr. Matt Freudelhuber from the U.S. Coast Guard.
Thanks, Sargon, and thanks, Captain Brady. So far, I can say it's been fantastic working with you and your staff, and appreciate your support and hope we continue to work well together. I'm Jack Falk, and I'm an environmental protection specialist in the Office of Water at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C. I've worked in the wastewater industry for about 30 years, with about half of that at EPA. Now part of the team addressing the new law that we'll be discussing today. And previously, I was the lead technical staff for the Vessel General Permit Program. And before we get into it, I'm going to turn it over and allow Matt to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Rodelhuber. I work with the Coast Guard as an environmental protection specialist in the Commercial Regulations and Standards Directorate, specifically for Captain Brady in the Office of Operating and Environmental Standards. I currently work on the ballast water program. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining. First, we have a few legal tidbits to address. The following EPA and Coast Guard presentation is intended to provide information to the public on the recently enacted Vessel Incidental Discharge Act and currently enforced statutes, permits, and regulations. Neither the slide presentation nor remarks of the participants represents final agency decisions regarding implementation of VIDA. Specific questions related to the content of this presentation should be referred to the appropriate agency. I want to add, we'll be using some what I would call unofficial terms to make the presentation a bit easier to understand. For example, when we use the term commercial vessels, what we really mean is the full range of vessels covered under VIDA. The proper term is non-recreational, non-vessels of the armed forces, which, if you hear that over and over again, can be a bit confusing to figure out what vessels we actually are covering. For the most part, the regulations will address commercial vessels, but similar to the existing Vessel General Permit, or VGP, VIDA covers activities on vessels such as emergency response, survey, and non-armed forces government-owned vessels that would not typically be considered commercial. Commercial vessels do account for over 95% of the universe of vessels that will be regulated under VIDA, so that's the term that we're going to use. Also, the VGP does, and VIDA will, address discharges incidental to the normal operation of a vessel when operating in a capacity as a means of transportation. That's a mouthful. So instead, we'll be using the condensed term incidental discharges. Hopefully, simplifying terms will help make the material easier to understand. And one final note, at times we'll call the new law the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act. More often than not, though, we will call it VIDA or VIDA, which you've heard today. There's already some disagreement as to what the proper pronunciation is, but they do both mean the same thing, and as of yet, there's no consensus on how to pronounce that acronym. So with that, let's get into an overview of what we're going to discuss today. Let me say first that today's webinar is intended to provide an overview of VIDA, discuss the implications of the VIDA legislation, and the future rulemaking process. I know that many of you are anxious to hear about future EPA and Coast Guard discharge requirements. However, those requirements will not be discussed much until later in the rulemaking process during future engagement opportunities. Today, we're limited to discussing only the requirements established immediately upon enactment of the legislation. More specifically, we'll briefly discuss the history of vessel regulations in the U.S., identify some vessel classes immediately impacted by VIDA, describe the scope of vessels, activities, and waters affected by VIDA, outline the regulatory process, and then identify both the immediate implications of VIDA as well as what it means for future regulation of these discharges. We'll also touch briefly on our outreach and communication plans for educating stakeholders about VIDA. And so one of the features of the GoToWebinar software is our ability to ask questions of the audience and to get immediate feedback. And so if we can post the first question, really to gauge the audience, we've gotten in the habit of asking a question really to see, often folks will sit together when they listen into the webinars, and so to get a full sense of how many people are actually participating in the webinar, we often ask, how many people are sitting in with you? So is it just you sitting at your computer? Are there 2 to 4 people looking at one screen, 5 to 10, or more than 10? So we had about 700 people sign up to listen to today's webinar from about 35 different countries. Ship owners, operators, and crew made up the largest percentage of participants, representing just short of half of the people that registered. Federal government, state government, industry consultants each made up another 10% of the audience, and then a large number of other groups of people identified with different groups associated with this presentation with VIDA. So the results, it looks like, we've asked this because there have been times where different rules, folks have gotten together in large groups. It seems as though today, largely, people are watching this on their own, 84%, and then smaller numbers of people sitting together. So that helps us, thank you. And now we can move on to more of the presentation. So numerous U.S. federal, state, and local requirements have been written over the years to address the regulation of vessel discharges. A few of the federal laws that are most affected by VIDA include the 1972 Clean Water Act, under which EPA issued the VGP, and where the new VIDA authority now exists to continue to regulate vessel discharges. The 1990 Non-Indigenous Aquatic Nuisance Prevention and Control Act, or NAMCA, and the 1996 National Invasive Species Act, or NISA, under which the Coast Guard administers its ballast water management program. Sections of these 3 laws have been amended or repealed by VIDA. The EPA began regulating incidental discharges from commercial vessels into waters of the United States in 2008 in response to a court decision that found EPA did not have the authority to exempt these discharges from its Clean Water Act permitting program. Shortly after that court decision, Congress revised the Clean Water Act to clarify that these requirements did not apply to recreational vessels, and except for ballast water, temporarily exempted from permitting small commercial vessels less than 79 feet in length and fishing vessels of all sizes, to allow Congress more time to assess the potential impacts of the regulation of incidental discharges from these vessels. EPA issued its first 5-year vessel general permit in 2008 to control incidental discharges from commercial vessels greater than 79 feet in length, and then reissued this permit in 2013. In anticipation of the ending of the permitting moratorium for smaller commercial vessels, EPA issued a small vessel general permit, or SVGP, to provide a more streamlined approach to compliance for those smaller vessels. The congressional permitting moratorium for these vessels finally ended in early 2018, thus requiring small vessels and fishing vessels to obtain permit coverage under either the SVGP or VGP for all incidental discharges. I'm now going to turn the microphone over to Matt to provide a brief history of the Coast Guard's regulation of these vessels.
Thank you, Jack. One of the Coast Guard's statutory missions is marine environmental protection. We've established and currently enforce a number of regulations directed at the prevention of discharges of pollutants from vessels into the waters of the U.S., including those related to sewage, bilge water discharge, and oily water treatment and discharge standards. Ballast water discharges are also an important environmental threat vector, so the Coast Guard diligently works to carry out congressional mandates to prevent economic, ecologic, and human health harms posed by this threat vector. When the Coast Guard established the ballast water discharge standard in 2012, it was an important step in the evolution of pollution prevention and control regulations. However, VIDA goes a step beyond and integrates the EPA's vessel general permit requirements and the Coast Guard's ballast water discharge standards, thereby establishing a uniform national framework under the legal authority of the Clean Water Act. While EPA and the Coast Guard implemented their respective statutory authorities, Congress recognized that the patchwork of authorities was challenging for the vessel community and began discussions about establishing a uniform framework for the regulation of incidental discharges in the U.S. And then the law that had been discussed in 9 consecutive sessions of Congress finally was signed. And the final law was titled the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, as Title IX of the Frank Lobiando Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2018. On December 4th, the President signed VIDA into law. VIDA established a uniform framework for regulation of incidental discharges from vessels. After the EPA develops regulations that establish performance standards for discharges, the Coast Guard is assigned the responsibility to develop regulations that implement those performance standards, including regulations related to inspections, monitoring, reporting, and record keeping. Until such time as the Coast Guard publishes its final rule, the requirements of the EPA's 2013 Vessel General Permit and the Coast Guard's Ballast Water Management Regulations will remain in full force and effect. No new revisions of the EPA's VGP will be issued. The VIDA requires the new regulations be no less stringent than the existing VGP. The existing VGP permits 27 specific discharges, including ballast water, and 5 general effluents, such as dissolvable cargo, will be considered for regulation, as will other identified incidental discharges. The Coast Guard currently regulates many of these discharges, such as oily water separator use for bilge water treatment, and will continue to do so until the final Coast Guard regulations are established. The timeline for VIDA started when the President signed it on December 4th. Under the law, the EPA has 2 years to publish national standards of performance for marine pollution control devices for each type of discharge that is regulated. The Coast Guard then has 2 years to publish regulations to implement those standards. As VIDA implementation moves out, the Coast Guard and EPA will work on their respective rulemakings, development of policy, engage in public outreach, and work to establish cooperative agreements between the federal government and state and regional organizations. The new VIDA standards will go into effect when the Coast Guard publishes its final regulations. EPA for the National Performance Standards and Coast Guard for the implementing regulations will issue notices of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register for public comment, and will consider those comments prior to publishing their final regulations. The Coast Guard inspectors and investigators are prepared to carry out these additional duties and responsibilities called for under VIDA. When VIDA passed in December of last year, the press highlighted that this action harmonized U.S. ballast water requirements with those of the International Maritime Organization. While that may be the ultimate outcome of VIDA, for now, that declaration, as we will discuss, is a bit premature. In fact, VIDA largely keeps the existing requirements in place until such time that EPA and Coast Guard develop new vessel discharge regulations. VIDA also provides for enhanced and regional ballast water requirements to address invasive species, but those requirements, too, do not take effect immediately. Also, VIDA requires the Coast Guard to consider ballast water test methods similar to those accepted by the IMO based on organism viability, but not immediately upon enactment of VIDA. The Coast Guard implementation of the regional ballast water requirements will be developed in concert with local stakeholders, such as the state governors and regional work groups, such as the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force. Regarding viability, the VIDA mandated that the Coast Guard publish a policy letter via the Federal Register, which addresses type approval testing methods and protocols for evaluating ballast water management systems that render organisms non-viable. If the Coast Guard accepts a testing method and protocol, it will then be used to measure concentrations of organisms in ballast water, certify the performance of ballast water management systems, and certify laboratories. The draft is expected to be published in June for comment, with a final policy published in December. Pending the publication of the draft in June, the Coast Guard is unable to provide any additional comment on that VIDA mandate. However, the Coast Guard looks forward to public input on the upcoming Federal Register announcement that will publish the draft policy for comment. We anticipate also posting a Maritime Commons article notifying stakeholders of the Federal Register publication.
The language of VIDA details the scope of activities to be covered under future regulations. Part of our process for developing the national discharge standards is to evaluate the full range of operations and incidental discharges on board vessels. Generally, though, the universe of discharges covered under VIDA is expected to be similar to the discharges already covered under the existing EPA 2013 VGP, as VIDA, like the VGP, applies to any incidental discharge from a commercial vessel. Note that VIDA does not change any existing federal requirements for sewage and is silent on sewage other than to specify that nothing in VIDA prevents a U.S. state from regulating sewage and that any incidental discharges commingled with sewage that are subject to both the VIDA requirements and any other laws applicable to sewage. This is the list of 27 discharges included in Section 2.2 of the current VGP, and which is the majority of incidental discharges covered under the VGP. A few additional discharges specific to certain classes of vessels are not included in this list. For example, inert gas scrubber discharges from tanker vessels are included in Part 5 of the current permit and will also be evaluated for under the new VIDA regulations. While we anticipate the majority of the discharges will remain the same under the new regulations, the language of VIDA does allow for the EPA to add additional discharges, combine discharges, and remove discharges. A good example of this is the use of exhaust gas recirculation to comply with air emission requirements and the scrubber discharges associated with that activity.
Generally, VIDA regulations will apply to ballast water discharges from all commercial vessels and for other incidental discharges from commercial vessels greater than 79 feet in length, excluding fishing vessels. VIDA permanently exempts from federal regulation incidental discharges other than ballast water from small commercial vessels and fishing vessels of all sizes. Consistent with smaller vessels no longer needing permit coverage for the full range of incidental discharges other than ballast water, VIDA permanently repeals the small vessel general permit. We are updating our estimate of the number of vessels subject to the VIDA requirements, but historically, for the vessel general permit, we've estimated about 70,000 vessels as being subject to those requirements. Here is a visual depiction of the vessel universe covered under the existing vessel general permit. For prospective U.S. flagged vessels, make up about 2/3 of the total. As you can see by the very different looking pie charts, and probably not surprising to most of you, the types of U.S. flagged vessels is quite different than that of foreign flagged vessels. In fact, approximately 90% of U.S. flagged vessels subject to these requirements are barges. Tugboats and towboats and passenger vessels such as ferries and miscellaneous other vessels such as offshore supply vessels make up most of the rest of the universe. The breakdown of foreign flagged vessels operating in the U.S. is quite different. Bulk carriers, tankers, container ships, and cargo ships make up more than 90% of the vessel universe. It is worth noting that As with the Vessel General Permit and existing Coast Guard ballast water regulations, we have not regulated foreign flagged or U.S. flagged vessels differently. Really is just the fact that these are largely two different groups of vessel classes. VIDA specifies that the new requirements will apply in waters of the United States and waters of the contiguous zone extending out 12 miles from shore. This is similar to existing Coast Guard ballast water regulations. However, the existing VGP requirements apply in waters of the United States and extending to the outer reaches of the 3-mile territorial sea. As such, for most discharges, the area where these requirements will apply will be extended further out to sea than the existing requirements. Also, VIDA identifies specific requirements that apply in certain waters, such as the Pacific region and the Great Lakes, and specifies that EPA and the Coast Guard are to consider waters subject to federal protection in whole or in part for conservation purposes when establishing requirements. These considerations are similar to those in the current VGP, but is something that we will consider and will continue to consider as we develop our new regulations.
As we mentioned earlier, VIDA passed with much being written about how the U.S. regulations are now consolidated into a uniform set of requirements and harmonized with the International Maritime Organization, or IMO, requirements. The fact is that upon passage of VIDA, few changes took effect immediately. For commercial vessels greater than 79 feet in length, the terms and conditions of the 2013 VGP and the existing Coast Guard ballast water requirements, as were in place the day VIDA was signed, are still in force and effect. Let me reiterate that today, the requirements in the 2013 permit and existing Coast Guard ballast water regulations are still applicable and enforceable. Similarly, U.S. states and local governments can continue to implement and enforce their state and local requirements. I want to highlight a few important points of what this means. For one, VIDA prohibits EPA from issuing a new VGP or even modifying the existing VGP. So while we are scheduled to publish a 2018 permit and then publicize that the permit would not be reissued until 2019, now, courtesy of VIDA, the 2013 VGP is the last vessel general permit to be issued by EPA. Additionally, and importantly, VIDA specifies that the 2013 VGP cannot be modified. Rather, the 2013 VGP requirements remain in force and in effect until new VIDA regulations are final, effective, and enforceable, which, as we will describe shortly, will likely not happen until late 2022.
Likewise, vessels seeking to discharge ballast water in the waters of the United States still need to comply with all current applicable regulations. Ballast water regulations will remain in full force and effect until new regulations are published in 2022.
Let me add, VIDA did have immediate implications for small vessels and fishing vessels, in that other than for ballast water, incidental discharges from these small commercial vessels less than 79 feet in length and fishing vessels of all sizes are no longer subject to regulation under the VGP or VIDA. We're now going to turn to our second polling question. Again, to gauge the audience's basic understanding of the current U.S. requirements for commercial vessel incidental discharges. As we had just discussed, the 2013 VGP, in addition to their current U.S. Coast Guard ballast water regulations, will continue to be federal requirements in the U.S. until we develop new VIDA regulations. So from that standpoint, we're curious how familiar you are with the requirements of the current 2013 Vessel General Permit. Very familiar, moderately familiar, or not familiar at all? I'll say my original thought was to ask you which VGP is currently in effect. The 2013 VGP, the 2018 VGP, or the 2019 VGP or none of the VGPs because VIDA has been enacted, but thought that I wouldn't want to make people look bad by not knowing the answer because there's been a lot of confusion over the applicability of the 2013 permit and the fact that we did not issue a 2018 or 2019 permit. So looking at your responses, it appears as though about a third of you are very here. Hopefully, if you're involved with incidental discharges, you'll be able to get out of the not at all familiar category, or you'll learn something today that will help you better understand the requirements. So with that, we are going to take our first break and do some questions from the audience. And I'm not quite sure. I think I'm going to turn it over to Sargon.
Thanks, Jack. We will now begin the first question and answer session. So we'll pause for a minute here so we can sort through all of those questions that have come in. So we'll go silent here on the line, but we'll be right back. So just please hang on the line and we'll be back in just a moment. Okay, we're back.
Yeah, so the first question that several people ask is, did I understand correctly that large and small fishing vessels are permanently exempt from VIDA, except for ballast water? And the answer to that is yes. VIDA, effective immediately, and in fact, VIDA immediately repealed the small vessel general permit, and for those small vessel, commercial vessels, and fishing vessels of all sizes, they are permanently exempt from the vessel general permit requirements and from future federal regulation, with the exception of ballast water. There was another question that asked about the applicability of reporting requirements. Am I still required to submit reports to both EPA and the Coast Guard? And again, under the current requirements with the VGP continuing in effect and the Coast Guard regulations continuing in effect, the answer is that for now, yes, there will still be reports required to be submitted to both of those agencies. And then I guess on the small vessel and fishing vessel lines, when specifically do the regulations requirements no longer apply? That actually took effect immediately upon enactment of VIDA. So as of December 4th, 2018, the incidental discharge requirements for those vessels were no longer applicable. And then let me just, one more question, and then we can move on. There was a question about, is VIDA part of the United States Clean Water Act, and what is the relationship to the NPDES permitting program? So VIDA is part of the Clean Water Act. Our NPDES program is part of the Clean Water Act, but there are two sections of the Clean Water Act, and in essence, VIDA moved the regulation of incidental discharges from one part that was regulated through permits to a second part that's now VIDA, the 312P of the Clean Water Act, that actually will be a direct implementation regulation that is what we're going to be discussing. And I think with that, we're going to move on. We tried to resist answering questions specific to the details of the future regulation of VIDA. We'll save those for the second half of the Q&A session later. So we're now going to talk about the future regulations. We've talked quite a bit, but haven't even discussed what VIDA actually changes. So now we're going to go through that and say how the VIDA activities will take shape over the next several years. VIDA, among other things, requires EPA and the Coast Guard to develop 2 federal regulations to address commercial vessel incidental discharges. First, EPA is required to develop national standards of performance and finalize those standards of performance by December 2020. Our current plan is to propose draft standards in the Federal Register for public comment early in 2020, and then finalize those standards to meet the December 2020 deadline as established in VIDA.
The Coast Guard then has 2 years to develop corresponding implementing, monitoring, and enforcement regulations, and to establish the compliance date for when the EPA standard and Coast Guard regulations are final, effective, and enforceable. I want to stress, and this is very important, the EPA standards scheduled to be finalized in late 2020 will not be enforceable until the date identified in the Coast Guard regulations, which VIDA specifies are to be published 2 years thereafter. Effective implementation of VIDA requires a significant amount of collaboration and coordination between EPA and the Coast Guard. As our interagency cooperation becomes better integrated, we will continue joint webinars and information sessions and updates to our websites. Transparency of process is one of our highest priorities, and the public will be privy to all notices of rulemaking as they're published in the Federal Register. So far, the joint work group that EPA and Coast Guard assembled is working extremely well. We will continue to work closely to ensure that our regulations are not conflicting between the 2 organizations. We're now going to discuss more about the details of the criteria, boundaries, and considerations established by VIDA for those EPA standards and the Coast Guard implementing regulations.
VIDA provides a number of considerations for EPA in developing discharge standards. For one, VIDA specifies that the new standards must be at least as stringent as the VGP, and specifically identifies parts of the VGP related to effluent limits. Part 2.1 of the VGP includes general effluent limits for discharges. 2.2 includes specific requirements for the 27 identified incidental discharges. And Part 5 includes vessel class-specific requirements for a set of vessel classes, including medium and large cruise ships, large ferries, tankers, barges, and emergency and rescue vessels. It's also worth mentioning that VIDA specifies that these effluent limits must also be at least as stringent with respect to waters subject to federal protection, in whole or in part for conservation purposes. For those of you familiar with the VGP, those are identified as Appendix G waters in the permit and includes waters of marine sanctuaries, national parks, national wildlife refuges, national wilderness areas, and national and wild scenic rivers. VIDA also requires that these requirements be technology-based. Technology-based requirements are intended to represent a reasonable level of treatment that is within the economic means of specific categories of industrial facilities. Specifically, EPA will consider 5 technological factors, including the age of equipment and facilities involved, the process employed, the engineering aspects of the application of various types of control technologies, any process changes, and non-water quality environmental impacts, including energy requirements. We're also required to consider the cost of achieving such effluent reductions. These same factors were considered when EPA developed the VGP. Also consistent with the VGP, requirements can be found in the form of numeric effluent limits, or we can use best management practices if numeric standards are infeasible, or if we determine BMPs are reasonably necessary to control these discharges. In establishing these limits, VIDA specifies that we can distinguish requirements among classes, types, and sizes of vessels, and between new and existing vessels. Again, this is similar to the considerations that went into EPA development of the VGP. Finally, in developing these limits, VIDA requires EPA to consult with interested U.S. state governors and in concurrence with the Coast Guard. For consultation with the governors, EPA is working with our Office of Congressional and Intergovernmental Relations to develop a clear process to allow interested governors to inform the development of the national discharge standards. While VIDA calls for consultation and concurrence, it allows EPA to move forward with standards despite objections as long as EPA responds to said objections.
As just discussed, Section P4 of VIDA provides a framework for the EPA to follow to develop standards. Subsections P6 and P10 of VIDA provide no such framework. Instead, those subsections include certain specific requirements applicable to ballast water that require little to no agency interpretation. Rather, these requirements will be incorporated into the regulations largely as written in VIDA. Importantly, these requirements become effective after the Coast Guard develops VIDA implementing regulations, and those regulations are final, effective, and enforceable. As mentioned earlier, that will likely be about 4 years from VIDA's December 2018 enactment date. The first of those provisions is the P6B of VIDA, in which establishes exchange and flushing requirements for any empty ballast tanks for which the residual water and sediments were not treated through a Coast Guard type-approved ballast water management system. The exchange or flush is to occur at least 200 nautical miles from any shore for voyages originating outside the United States or Canadian Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, or at least 50 nautical miles from any shore for a voyage originating within the United States or Canada. Exchange or flushing is not required for vessels that operate exclusively within the internal waters of the United States or Canada, or if the residual water and sediment was sourced from the same port or place of destination, or within the contiguous portions of a single captain of the port zone. Also, exchange and flushing is not required if doing so would compromise the safety of the vessel, or is otherwise prohibited by any law pertaining to vessel safety, or if the vessel design prevents such an exchange to occur. Next, subsection P6C of VIDA specifies that conditionally during a vessel's service life, applicable standards are those that apply at the time of installation of the ballast water management system within the service life of that system, provided the system has a valid Coast Guard type-approved certificate and is maintained and used as required by the Coast Guard and in accordance with the manufacturer's specifications. The Coast Guard does have the authority to require a different treatment system for such vessel or category of vessels for which the benefit of retrofitting a different system would exceed the cost of doing so. The third ballast water specific requirement to be codified into regulation can be found in subsection P10A of VIDA that establishes permanent ballast water exchange plus treatment requirements for vessels entering the St. Lawrence Seaway via the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Similar to the exchange and flushing requirements for empty ballast tanks, exchange or flushing is required at least 200 nautical miles from any shore for voyages originating outside the United States or Canadian EEZ, or at least 50 nautical miles from any shore for a voyage originating within the United States or Canada. Also, similarly, these requirements do not apply if complying would compromise the safety of the vessel or is otherwise prohibited by any law pertaining to vessel safety, or if the vessel design prevents such an exchange to occur. Any vessel with no residual ballast or sediments on board, or that retains all ballast on board while operating in the waters of the United States or the waters of the contiguous zone, is not subject to these requirements. The fourth ballast water specific provision of VIDA is included in subsection P10C and establishes minimum exchange and flushing requirements for commercial vessels operating in the Pacific region of the United States. As with the other exchange and flushing requirements, these provisions do not apply if compliance would compromise the safety of the vessel, or if the vessel design prevents such an exchange to occur. Also, any vessel certified by the Coast Guard as having no residual ballast or sediments on board, and that any ballast tanks are sealed, is not subject to these requirements. In establishing Pacific region requirements, VIDA defines that region to include all federal and state waters to the entire EEZ adjacent to the west coast of the United States mainland, Alaska, and Hawaii. This expands the Pacific region concept used in the VGP to also include Hawaii. The Pacific region requirements are logically provided for two different scenarios. The first scenario, for vessels operating between two ports in the Pacific region, or one of these ports and a port on the Pacific coast of Canada or Mexico above 20 degrees north latitude. VIDA establishes that these vessels must either use a Coast Guard type-approved ballast water management system or perform a ballast water exchange at least 50 nautical miles from shore. Note that VIDA does exempt certain voyage patterns in each of the 5 Pacific region states from this requirement. I'm not going to describe each one of these for you, but for example, between the Port of Los Angeles, the Port of Long Beach, and the El Segundo Offshore Marine Terminal, these voyages are exempt from exchange if the ballast water is to be discharged from the vessel, and that ballast water originated solely from these 3 locations. The second scenario applies to any vessel that transports ballast water with a measured salinity of less than 18 parts per thousand, and voyages to a Pacific region port or place of destination, also with a measured salinity of less than 18 parts per thousand. In these cases, a complete ballast water exchange is required at least 50 nautical miles from shore if the ballast is sourced from the Pacific region, or more than 200 nautical miles from shore if any other location. An important exception to this exchange requirement is that VIDA provides that exchange is not required for vessels that are able to treat ballast water with a system approved by the Coast Guard that is roughly 100 times more effective than the existing Coast Guard type approval requirements. This slide provides the more stringent discharge standard at which point exchange of low salinity ballast is not required. The 5 parameters are listed in the first column. The second column shows the discharge standard currently in place for the IMO D2 standards, the Coast Guard regulations, and the EPA VGP. The third column has the Pacific region discharge standards, which, as you can see, for the 2 organism size classes, the standards are 100 times more stringent, while less so, but still more stringent for the other parameters. One important note to add is that vessels that meet these standards are exempt from exchange, but only if the treatment system has been type approved by the Coast Guard to meet these more stringent standards. As most of you probably know, the Coast Guard currently type approves systems against a single set of discharge standards. To begin, the Coast Guard is working closely with EPA to implement the requirements of VIDA and ensure environmental protection of U.S. waters. Under VIDA, the Coast Guard will develop implementation, compliance, and enforcement requirements for the discharge standards set by EPA. These regulations must be as stringent as existing requirements. The Coast Guard will not simply inherit the VGP from EPA. Rather, we are tasked with creating a program that is no less stringent than the VGP. This will include regulations governing the design, construction, testing, approval, installation, and use of marine pollution control devices to ensure compliance with the standards of performance. We don't know what the EPA's final discharge standard will look like, but we know that the existing VGP contained 27 specific discharges, including ballast water, and 5 general effluents such as dissolvable cargo. The Coast Guard already regulates many of these discharges, such as oily water separator use for bilge water treatment, so this is not a new role for us. As previously mentioned, the timeline for implementation started when the bill was signed on December 4th of last year. Under the law, the EPA has 2 years to publish standards and regulations. The Coast Guard then has 2 more years to publish our regulations, which implement those standards. In the meantime, there are a number of policymakers, stakeholder outreach efforts, and cooperative agreements that have to be developed between the federal government and state or regional organizations. VIDA establishes how discharge standards and implementing regulations are to be enforced and specifies that the Coast Guard has the primary responsibility for enforcing the regulations. Importantly, though, VIDA provides EPA as well as states and territories of the United States authority to also enforce the federal requirements. Coast Guard expects to enforce the new discharge standards in the same manner that we do now with marine inspectors, port state control officers, and investigators during regularly scheduled inspections. The law, however, gives individual states the authority to enforce the standard as well as petition the EPA and the Coast Guard for alternative standards. Details on how that will be administered is being addressed in our regulatory development process. At present, the Coast Guard allows temporary use of foreign type-approved ballast water management systems. This is our AMS, or Alternate Management System provision in the current ballast water regulations. It's not clear how this will be impacted by new regulations and policies promulgated under VIDA. Compliance takes place through existing domestic inspections and port state control examinations. The Coast Guard can prevent departure or revoke clearance of vessels for failure to comply with VIDA requirements. Currently, extensions to ballast water discharge standard compliance dates, or extensions granted prior to publication of the new Coast Guard regulations, will remain effective. It's not clear how extensions may or may not change in new or revised regulations.
First, let me be clear that when we talk about states in the context of VIDA, we're talking about the United States of America, as opposed to foreign states, as the term is used, say, for example, in the IMO. As Congress identified, the purpose of VIDA is to harmonize the patchwork of requirements into a uniform set, but also to preserve the flexibility of states to administer and enforce vessel discharge requirements of particular concern to the individual states. To that end, in addition to the state consultation during EPA's standard development process and subsequent Coast Guard's implementing regulations, VIDA provides other opportunities for the states to influence requirements for incidental discharges. First, subsection P7AI of VIDA specifies that governors can petition EPA or the Coast Guard to issue an order requiring use of additional best management practices for a category of vessels or in a specific location, if necessary, to reduce the risk of introduction or establishment of aquatic nuisance species, or that will mitigate adverse effects of discharges that contribute to a violation of water quality requirements. In this instance, EPA must grant or deny such a request within 180 days, and if granted, issue the order immediately. It should also be noted that EPA can issue these emergency orders without having specifically received a request from a governor. Second, subsection P7A2 provides that governors can also petition EPA or the Coast Guard if new information exists that could reasonably result in a change to an existing standard, regulation, or policy developed under VIDA. This provision applies once the new VIDA regulations are in force. In this instance, EPA or the Coast Guard must grant or deny such a request within 1 year, and if granted, must publish in the Federal Register a notice of proposed rulemaking within 30 days of the determination to grant the petition. Third, subsection 10D of VIDA establishes authority for states to establish no discharge zones, more commonly known as NDZs, prohibiting one or more types of discharges into some or all waters within the state that require greater environmental protection. Like the petition process described above, NDZs cannot be established until after the new VIDA regulations are in force. Upon submission of an application from a state, EPA has 90 days to approve or disapprove a request, and if approved, prohibit any such discharge by regulation, whether treated or not, into waters as requested in the state application. Applications must include and address a number of criteria, issues, and factors. While the term NDZ is similar to that currently used for sewage, VIDA identifies a different set of factors than in place for sewage, and as such will require a different type of analysis, both by states and EPA. And finally, subsection P10C of VIDA provides state-specific requirements focused on the Great Lakes. I'm not going to get into the details of VIDA for this, but in essence, it establishes procedures for governors of the 8 Great Lakes states to work together to identify enhanced standards of performance or other requirements for discharges within the Great Lakes. The process includes limited input from EPA and the Coast Guard, the Great Lakes Commission, federal and provincial governments of Canada, and the public. However, at the end of the day, VIDA authorizes the Great Lakes states to be primarily responsible for establishing any enhanced requirements. A key concept of this is that all 8 Great Lakes state governors must endorse any enhanced requirement that would impose additional equipment requirements on vessels, while endorsement from only 5 of the 8 governors is needed for any enhanced requirement that would not impose additional equipment requirements. As such, enhanced requirements, or any such enhanced requirements, are then to be submitted to EPA and the Coast Guard for publication in the Federal Register within 180 days of receipt. VIDA includes a number of non-regulatory programs intended to improve understanding of invasive species risks from vessel discharges and establishes methods for addressing these risks. The first such program is identified as an intergovernmental response framework in subsection P6E of VIDA. Both EPA and the Coast Guard are tasked with working together to establish a framework for intergovernmental response to aquatic nuisance species risks from vessel discharges and a companion framework to establish a risk assessment and response framework to identify and track aquatic invasive species populations, evaluate associated risks, and establish emergency best management practices that may be deployed rapidly to respond to any threats. The second program is the Coastal Aquatic Invasive Species Mitigation Grant Program and Mitigation Fund. This program is outside the purview of the EPA and Coast Guard and will be managed by the Secretary of Commerce and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The purpose of that program is to award grants to support the prevention, mitigation, and restoration of areas affected by aquatic invasive species. VIDA establishes that $5 million annually is to be available for this program. and interestingly, an additional amount equal to any penalties collected for violations of VIDA requirements during the previous year. The third program is the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain Invasive Species Program, which will be administered by EPA's Great Lakes National Program Office. That program is multi-purpose, but some of the objectives are to monitor aquatic nuisance species in the Great Lakes, to work collaboratively with other agencies to develop criteria and response actions for prioritizing and distributing monitoring efforts, and to work on efforts geared toward type approval of ballast water management systems applicable to vessels operating solely within the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain. VIDA authorizes appropriations of $50 million a year for 5 years, although to date, no money has been appropriated for this program. A report to Congress summarizing activities under that program is due by the end of 2019. And with that, we are going to now ask our third polling question, and this is really to help us gauge how best to share additional information, but let you also see how others heard about this webinar. And so the question is, how did you hear about this event? An email listserv received from an original EPA sent email, an email forwarded from a colleague, EPA or U.S. Coast Guard website, Twitter, or some other way. And we'll wait a second to give folks a chance to respond, and then we can take a look. We're actually going to be asking you, if you stick on after the end of the webinar and fill out the survey, there is a question that asks you for your preferred method. So hopefully we can better gauge how to notify folks for any future rulemaking activities, communication and outreach activities. So it looks like most of you, not surprisingly, received it via email. I'll probably leave it at that. I think probably more importantly, we'll be to see what your preferred method is of being notified. Our plan is we have a number of different email lists that we will use to try and keep people interested. We do intend to post more information on our website over time as it becomes available. So while now it may be sparse, hopefully over time it will become more valuable, both EPA as well as the Coast Guard's website. And so now, before we answer some more questions, just want to highlight what our plans are for educating stakeholders about VIDA. As some of you may have seen, both EPA and the Coast Guard have published new web pages specific to VIDA. Pages are relatively sparse now, but there are locations where we intend to post or link to any EPA or Coast Guard activity specific to VIDA. The pages are easy to find through an internet search for either EPA or VIDA, or the EPA and VIDA, or the Coast Guard and VIDA. Today is also one of the planned webinars for providing stakeholders with an overview of VIDA and the Coast Guard and EPA's plans for addressing the new VIDA legislation. We plan to host a second webinar next week, and we'll publish a recording of both within a couple weeks after the live sessions. These recordings will be accessible from the EPA and Coast Guard VIDA websites. EPA and the Coast Guard are also co-hosting an in-person listening session on the 29th and 30th of this month. That session, which is free of charge to attend, will be at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy in Kings Point, New York, and will be an opportunity to hear a presentation similar to the webinar, a discussion about current requirements for a few key discharges, and an opportunity for stakeholders to provide any thoughts or concerns about the EPA and Coast Guard's current requirements that may help inform future requirements. Again, while not certain, we expect to host in-person listening sessions once we propose our national standard of performance early next year, as well as additional webinars. Finally, As with any federal agency rulemaking in the United States, EPA and the Coast Guard are required to publish a notice of proposed rulemaking that allows for a period of time for the public to review and submit comments on that proposed rule. We must consider any comments received on those proposals when finalizing the requirements and provide an explanation as part of the final regulation for how those comments were addressed. And for those of you with questions, mentioned the EPA and Coast Guard websites. Yeah, I would recommend if you type EPA Vessels, Marinas, and Ports homepage in any internet search engine, that will probably be the first hit you get is to our homepage. And similarly for the 2 U.S. Coast Guard web pages shown, easily accessible through internet searches. And for email, should you have information you would like to send to us, or if you have additional questions, EPA and Coast Guard group email boxes are shown on the screen.
Just a quick note about the Coast Guard email address. It's not a space in between environmental and standards. It's actually an underscore. It's like a dash just at the bottom. Yeah.
Great. So thank you both for that. We'll now begin the second and final question and answer period. So once again, we'll take a brief moment to go silent here as we review those that have come in and try to address some of your questions. There have been plenty of them, so thank you for your engagement. So please sit tight, and we'll be back in just a moment.
All right, sorry for the delay. We talked about kind of the multitude of questions that came in, and just kind of want to highlight some of the ones that we heard from multiple people. And one of them is, what do we have to do now? And just to reiterate that the current VGP and Coast Guard regulations remain in place and effect, and so you're required to continue to meet those until EPA develops standards and then the Coast Guard develops implementing regulations. And once those Coast Guard implementing regulations are final, effective, and enforceable, at that point, the existing EPA vessel general permit requirements and existing Coast Guard ballast water requirements no longer apply. There were a number of questions that people had about vessel-specific questions, and I would say that for those vessel-specific questions, it's a bit of a tongue twister. If you can send those to the Coast Guard email address shown on the contacts page, that they will be able to respond to those directly. There were questions also about will we be doing an economic impact assessment as part of this rule, and we will be doing that consistent with how federal agencies are required to perform that assessment in developing any regulation, and that there will be information provided when we propose the rule that will include the draft economic impact assessment that you will also be able to comment on as part of the rulemaking package. There was a question about whether there will be tribal engagement as part of the rulemaking, and we do have a tribal consultation requirement that we will be undertaking. I believe that will start in mid-summer, early to mid-summer of this year, and we'll be working with our tribal office at EPA to coordinate that. There was also a question about how long of a comment period there will be when we propose, I assume, both our standards as well as the Coast Guard implementing regulations. And I can say at this minute that it will be at least 30 days. I know that we generally like it to be longer, often the calendar. There were also questioning whether we really intended to meet the December 2020 deadline. And our intention is to meet that, but in doing so, everything we're doing has been condensed. And so we would love to offer as long of a comment period as possible, but time constraints to try and meet our deadline may limit. So our challenge and our goal will be to make sure that folks are well aware when we intend to propose the rule, put people on notice, and get people access to that draft rulemaking package or proposed rulemaking package as soon as possible. There are also some comments asking about the public listening session in Kings Point, New York, and I think whether the questions were, is it open for anybody to attend? And the answer is yes. There was a question about whether it was going to be, people were going to be able to listen to it remotely. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do that. So unless you're there in person, you won't be able to participate in the active dialogue. We will have a summary of that meeting that to be determined what it will consist of, but we'll try our best to make information from that available to folks, certainly as part of the rulemaking package. I think I am going to have the Coast Guard answer. There was a question about dissolvable cargo. No? Okay. No, we'll pass on that then. I don't know if we have other questions.
Jack, would you like to speak a little bit about what the difference is between a permit requirement and the regulatory requirements, and the difference between a NPDES permit essentially and Clean Water Act 312? Yeah. And a 5-year review cycle versus a 5-year reissuance? Sure.
So yeah, the current vessel general permit under the Clean Water Act requires that we issue a permit that it can be issued for no longer than 5 years. The permit is issued under our regulatory authority, which is given to us through the Clean Water Act. So the law is the Clean Water Act. We developed the specific regulations and implementing regulations of that law, and then we issued permits as a condition of part of the regulations that said EPA will regulate the discharge of pollutants to waters of the U.S. through a permit. And so that's the current framework. VIDA removes the permit mechanism. In essence, though, the requirements are still applicable, will still be applicable. The difference being that there's not an application or notice of intent process to be covered. In essence, it would be If you fall under the scope of vessels and activities identified in the VIDA regulation, you are subject to those requirements automatically. There is no application process. There is no review of acceptability. The expectation is that you meet those requirements that will be established directly in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations.
A few folks are asking about the webinars next week. Will it be the same information, and will this information be the same at Kings Point as well?
So for next week, the webinar will be the same. The difference will be the questions that we get and how we answer those questions. At Kings Point, we will likely give a similar or maybe slightly condensed version of this webinar, and then our plan is to get into some of the discharges that in registering for the session, we've asked people to identify which discharges they're most interested in hearing about. And so based on that and based on our understanding of which discharges are probably ones that we and the Coast Guard are most interested at taking a deeper look at right now, we'll have individual discussions of those discharges, ballast water, of course, being the easy example. But we anticipate probably having 5 discharges or so that we'll specifically discuss, talk about the current requirements, and then really look to solicit input from the audience on challenges, suggestions, etc., that they have with the current requirements, as well as looking for information identifying new technologies, new activities, practices, etc., that are out there that we in the Coast Guard should consider as we develop our regulations. And then we'll have a final session that's really for all other discharges for the other parts of VIDA, so the no discharge zones, I think that the state petition process and so forth, that really will be open-ended, largely looking for input from the audience on suggestions for our consideration.
Jay, I noticed that some people were asking about VIDA potentially conflicting with existing regulations, and I assume that we will take a close look at that to make sure that nothing coming out, so no new regulations conflict with old regulations. However, it says here that multiple times people caught you trying to say VIDA, but you changed halfway through. Why is it that you refuse to say it properly?
Well, according to, no, I'm sorry.
I think it was more the first part of the question.
The conflicting regulations part, we will take a closer look at that. I mean, I think a good example is the way we wrote our vessel general permit for exchange plus treatment in the Great Lakes is different than the way VIDA established exchange plus treatment requirements for vessels entering the Great Lakes. And so for something like that, VIDA lays out the exact language for the requirement, and so EPA or the Coast Guard don't have much say in what the requirement is. We have to implement the law as written. There are, I'll say, on the fringes of those in the interpretation where there may be a slightly different, potentially slightly different interpretation. And so at the end of the day, will the VIDA regulations be different than the VGP? Yes. Will they conflict? No, because the VGP will go away once the regulations are in force.
Jack, can you speak just a bit about the timeline for the state consultation process?
So the state consultation process is when federal government develops regulations, we have to consider executive order on federalism. And as part of federalism, we generally meet with a number of state organizations. And so that's a normal part of the process. VIDA has added an additional specific element that says that we need to consult with the states on the proposed rulemaking, which in essence is very similar to what we have to do already on federalism. And so rather than having one process for federalism and one process for working with state governors, we're trying to come up with a single process where we can accomplish both goals through one process. We do envision that will likely begin July timeframe, and then depending, I think we're fairly open after kind of the initial federalism meetings to work with the states, I will say, more as a group than individually, to the best as we can, to share our VIDA goals. I think that one of the challenges is that we will not, similar as with other entities, be able to say what those new requirements will look like as part of that consultation process. I think we can be probably a little more open on the things we're considering, but it's very difficult to say too much more than that, even as part of the consultation with the state governors.
Jack, last question, and then we'll wrap things up. We talked about when we plan to publish the final rule, but could you provide any insight to when EPA might be providing the notice of proposed rulemaking or proposed standards for people to comment on?
Yes. So it will, our current plan is to publish the proposed standards by early 2020. Ideally, I would like to say that will be January or February. We are working hard to meet that goal. Potentially, it may slip a month, but it really is expected to be early in 2020, with the final goal still of, as the authors of VIDA said at one meeting, we don't have to finish our standards in December of 2020. We have to finish our standards by December 4th of 2020. So we're moving forward with the goal of meeting that, knowing that we have to get the proposal out as soon as possible to be able to meet that December 2020 deadline. And I think with that, we are going to wrap it up. Thank you for all the questions. I think we got somewhat inundated. I think whether we answer them today or not, we will definitely read them all, consider them all as we work through our rulemaking process. Hopefully you found the information today to be informative. Look forward to hearing more from you and other stakeholders in the coming months. Again, remind you that we'll be doing this webinar next Wednesday. And then if you missed it, be sure, or if your colleagues missed it, you may want to remind them. We will be posting recordings of the webinar on our VIDA website in a couple weeks. We have our 2-day in-person listening session scheduled for May 29th and 30th at the Merchant Marine Academy in Kings Point, where, again, you can share your views, probably in a more open forum than listening on a webinar. You can visit our EPA or Coast Guard VIDA websites for details on that session. And with that, I think I will thank you and pass it back to Sargon.
Great, that wraps up our meeting for today. So just again, a reminder for those interested in revisiting the content of the webinar, or if you have colleagues who may wish to view it, the Today's session was recorded and will be posted to EPA's VIDA website within the next couple weeks. And again, the content will be repeated next week, so it will be identical in content with the exception of the questions. So thank you again for your participation, and we now conclude today's webinar.